My name is Scott Blossom, and I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, but I currently live in Berkeley with my wife, Chandra, and our two kids, Tara and Tejas. I found yoga, or yoga found me, when I was about 19 years old, and I was going to the City College in Santa Barbara. And my best friend, Matt Basindian, who's also made some Yoga Anytime content, went to a yoga class, and he basically, rung me up and said, you have to come directly to the next yoga class, and I did. And it was this Iyengar teacher named Freddie Castellanos teaching at this tennis club that was really close to my house. And so we literally snuck in for the entire summer, and it was the summer right before I went off to UC Santa Cruz to finish my biology degree. And so, and it was so funny because yoga was getting popular enough to be at tennis clubs, but at the same time, there was nobody in the class. We would literally be the only two people in the class, so Freddie was happy to have one more person rather than just having one, and we eventually became very good friends with him. And it was an interesting time in my life because I had gone into a depression. I had taken a trip abroad, and I think I got a kind of reflection about myself and what a jerk I was, would be one way to put it. And I think I kind of imploded. And for about 6 months, I was just in a lot of emotional pain, and I didn't even have the words for it. But looking back, especially being a clinician now, I know I was in some kind of depression, like a clinical depression. And the yoga class I remember that first class it was like a crack of light in a very dark time. And I thought, wow, this is the best that I've felt in months. And that was it. And then I went all summer long to the classes. It was an Iyengar style yoga, and then I went off to UC Santa Cruz and continued studying Iyengar yoga up there too. So that was how it started. I came to study acupuncture as an offshoot of getting a biology degree at UC Santa Cruz. So I had gotten into yoga, and part of what that did was, one, it really helped me to come out of this depressed state that I was in, but it also really turned me on to the possibilities of Eastern thought, Eastern philosophy, Eastern practices. And so I had begun studying the Tao Te Ching and learning those poems and being really blown away by the wisdom and the poetry in those poems. And I took a medical anthropology class as part of my biology requirements, and I was in the pre-med track, so I was going to become a doctor, an MD. And then I took this medical anthropology class, and we studied cross-cultural views of healing, and it was actually the first time that I had been exposed to traditional Chinese medicine. And it was sort of a synergy of, I found out that the medicine was also based on the Tao and the yin and the yang, and I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I would love to practice a medicine that was based on such a beautiful philosophy. And simultaneously, integrative medicine had just begun to become a major kind of trend in Western medicine, using practices from Eastern cultures like yoga, acupuncture, meditation, etc., and in conventional settings with all kinds of things, especially things like cancer and heart disease. And so all of that was really burgeoning, and I thought, this is a great opportunity. I don't need to go into this kind of conventional Western medical path. I could study traditional Chinese medicine and still be involved in conventional medical settings in a niche that was an integrative niche, which for me was much more interesting, and I really became passionate about that, and that's exactly what I ended up doing. So I was also pursuing, Ayurvedic studies at the same time that I was going to college, partly because of the same class that I found out about Chinese medicine in, which was the medical anthropology class. And I had gone to study with a great Indian teacher named Dr. Vasant Lad. And Dr. Lad has had arguably one of the biggest influences on Ayurveda in America. But I'm a pragmatic person, and I really wanted to work in conventional settings and make a contribution to integrative medicine. I had more of an activist kind of mindset where I wanted to really change the system from within and bring those things into conventional settings that I knew in my heart of hearts and in my rational mind too were going to be very useful and very compatible. And so I had studied Ayurveda actually at the exact same time as I was first getting introduced to Chinese medicine, but Ayurveda was much farther behind in the way that it had been integrated into conventional settings, whereas traditional Chinese medicine at that time was already accepted by certain kinds of insurance. There was research happening on it in conventional medical settings, and so I was very pragmatic, partly because I was so young. I was only 23 years old, so I thought, well, I can study Chinese medicine and get that degree after I finish my biology degree, and then I'll move on to study Ayurveda more formally after that, and that's what I did. I finished studying Chinese medicine when I was 27, and that's when I went into more of a formal education in Ayurveda. But I, all through Chinese medical school, continued to read books, mainly by Dr. Robert Svoboda, who I, by the grace of the universe, was lucky enough to meet and get to have his tutorship and mentorship over all these years. My experience around learning these different traditions, the medical traditions, as well as practicing yoga, has been really, really benefited from some wonderful teachers. And so Dr. Svoboda has been the biggest influence that I've had in terms of Ayurvedic medicine. And then I've had a long-term relationship with my Hatha Yoga guide and mentor, whose name is Zhander Remete, who is the founder of the Shadow Yoga School of Hatha Yoga. And in both cases, there was really an understanding of what in Ayurveda, or not in Ayurveda, in Sanskrit is called vidya. And vidya literally is the same word that we get our word video from. It's got the same Indo-European roots. So it has to do with the way you see something. It has to do with the viewpoint. And so in both cases, Dr. Svoboda and Zhander were really, they both had a very distinct perspective on things, and they both were able to articulate that the practices and the understandings that I was interested in studying were going to be really, really conditioned on working to the point of knowing things by heart, And so in that sense, you can do something for a long time and many times over and over some kind of practice or technique, and you learn some things and you notice lots of things and you have different experiences. But it's often when you have a teacher who's a very adept person, and both Dr. Svoboda and Zhander are extremely adept in their arts, that they were able to really demonstrate to me a level of mastery that communicated the necessity for continuing to find something new in something that you may be very familiar with. And so they have this profound quality of going deeper and deeper and deeper into a subject, and actually without so much changing the externals of what you're doing, that you're actually doing the same thing externally but from an entirely different internal point, so that like a diamond you start to see the practice as facets of light. You're noticing something from every angle that's true, and if you're really working the practice in a masterful way, you after a while become aware of those different facets, and they become things that can actually provide healing and inspiration when you need it, as you need it. And there's actually a saying in India that the moon is stronger than the sun. And so it's a kind of an odd thing to say, because we all know the sun is this, extremely powerful ball of fire, and the moon is just this little rock that reflects the sun's light. But we also know that if you try to look directly at the sun, you go blind. It's impossible. If you stay out in the sun too long, you get burnt. It's a very kind of intense energy, and it's too much for just a human. Whereas you can gaze at the beautiful moonlight for hours and hours, and that reflection, that soft lunar reflection, is something that we can actually digest. And so in that same way, the mentor, the teachers that we have, offer a way to understanding via reflection. So they helped, both of my teachers have really helped me to understand myself, and helped me to gauge where the areas that I continued to grow, continued to learn ways that I needed to continue to practice. Even when I may have thought I had gotten to a level of proficiency and mastery with something, they would help me to see what the next step was in whatever way that I was developing. And of course, there's that lends itself to being married for a long time. It lends itself to raising children. It lends itself to working a career for a long time, where the reflection is that there's always a possibility to continue to grow if you see it that way. So I guess that would be the essence of learning to really have a vidya about something that I am very grateful to have inherited from my teachers, and continue to really feel blessed. So I'm a householder. As I mentioned, I have a wife and 2 children, and I have parents, and I'm 46 years old currently, so I'm really right in the sandwich of having parents that are aging that do need my support in some ways, and then I have children that are dependent on me for certain kinds of support, and I have a commitment to my wife, I have a commitment to my mortgage, I have various things that I'm doing that are very conventional and very mundane. And so being a householder yogi for me is it's a lot about priorities, because as Zorba the Greek put it, the full catastrophe is what Zorba the Greek called this stage of life. It's when, and in Indian terminology, they call the householder stage grahasta. And grahasta literally comes from our word in English for grab. That's where the gra part comes. And hasta means hand. It means that the universe has its hold on you. And so, because you have responsibilities and duties to many things and people. And so in that way, when there's so many responsibilities like there are currently in my life, I have had to become very, very clear about what's important, and I've had to actually, choose to let certain things go that may have been fun but are not really essential to what I'm doing. And so for me, and my wife as well, because she's a Tibetan Buddhist scholar and an avid shadow yogi, she studied with Chandra as well for over 15 years now. We're both very clear that our practice is what allows us to take care of ourselves, to continue to grow, to do our inner work so that we can show up as evolving people for our children. And if I have, an opinion about what parenthood is the parent's job is not to make the child. The parent's job is to actually be a living example of an adult human fulfilling themselves in a way that actually takes into consideration all the commitments and responsibilities they have, which includes them. So we make a big point of actually including our children in the practice of giving us space to really be dedicated to our practices, and in return, we keep our lives as simple as we can so that we can be available to them. As a clinician for the last 20 years or so, I have worked one-on-one and with groups of people over that time in many different settings. And the interesting thing about staying with it and continuing to have a busy clinical practice in Berkeley to this day is that there are kind of human trends, and there's things that I see that are universals for people. And in the modern age, meaning the kind of post-internet age, which started 20 years ago or so, the main thing is actually overstimulation, overwork. And there are a bunch of stats about workaholism being as big of a problem as any other addiction. But it's an odd one in the sense that it's the one addiction that gets celebrated, because when people are maniacs around work, they often are materially successful and they can do a lot of things that they might get awards for and accolades for. But the main thing that I see today is that people are overextended, overbusy, overworked, and they don't see a way out of it. Something about technology has facilitated the capacity to go fast. And of course, it used to, you sent your letter off on the Pony Express and you hoped to get a letter back in 3 to 6 months. That was a drag. So I completely understand why it's so, brilliant to be able to send somebody you love an email and actually, have a connection that's so immediate with them, or, talk to them on Skype or something like that. And so there's good reasons I see for it, but there's always a downside and a dark side to any technological advance, because people stop using it and it begins to use them. And so they start assuming that speed is natural, speed is better, when in fact some very important aspects of cultivating emotional intelligence, cultivating wisdom, cultivating deep knowledge of yourself and the things that you're into in the world require slowness. They actually cannot even bud and branch and flower and fruit without some prolonged, slow relationship with those things. And so really the main thing that people need to detoxify, because I get a lot of people in my particular line of doctoring, people come to me for detoxification a lot, and I often say that you need to detoxify your nervous system of all of the busyness and the speed, and you need to simplify your life, slow down. That is the challenge, and it often proves to be much more challenging than people would assume when you ask them to do something simple like sleep more, make more time and space for yourself to do nothing, to rest, hang out in nature, attune yourself to rhythms that have not been dominated or created by technological world kind of issues. So currently for me, some of the things that are really, really juicy, really interesting questions, it's something along the lines of leaning into my weak side, leaning into my vulnerability, trying to spend some time sitting with the things that I have built lots of habits around avoiding, and then finding how much energy and power there is in that place where I wouldn't call it a comfortable place, but it's a very alive place. So that also includes being really open to the suffering of others, to the grief of the world. And then in my yoga practice, particularly, there's more of a kind of devotional sense, a sense of giving up my personal will and offering it to some kind of alignment with something bigger as a thing that guides the practice, so that I'm starting to scale back the sense of will, the sense of effort in the practice, and instead spend more effort and energy, or not effort, but more attention and more intention with just trusting the intelligence of my body, trusting the intelligence of my heart, and opening to what's there. So the abstract quality, or to say trusting my heart, trusting the intelligence of my body, is it can sound philosophical, and so to make it practical, to make it an actual living experience for myself, that to me is the kind of alchemical gold, where it becomes an embodied experience. Like there's actually a feedback, there's a yes from my body, there's a yes from my heart. And the main way that expresses itself physiologically is to feel like my own personal likes and dislikes take a back seat to it's the kind of pull that you feel when you get into a river. There's a way that my body understands what it needs to do in any given yoga practice. And if I'm listening closely enough, it actually takes over after a while. And I think that's one of the fruits of long-term practice, is you've developed a certain momentum and a certain patterning where you start doing something, and your body has a certain ability to just start doing it. But if you get out of the way with your sort of identification with it, you'll always do it a little bit differently, and it'll always have a feeling of being a little wild, and so there's a sacredness in wild activity. And in fact, the word in Latin, the root of the word sacred, means wild. in the sense of wilderness, but the internal quality is you don't feel completely safe. You feel a little vulnerable, you feel a little shaky, you feel a little bit like you're not sure what's going to come next, and that place is, at some level, a place I think a lot of us build up a lot of habits around avoiding because it does feel shaky and vulnerable. But those are some of the main qualities where there's actually something it's just a little bit, there's a spontaneity and an openness in it to it that feels wild, like you're encountering something that isn't going to necessarily take your opinions and your likes and dislikes as the primary consideration. Well, I've been really lucky in terms of teachers. My first major yoga influence along the Iyengar lines was Eric Schiffman, and he really inspired me along the lines of a kind of quantum awareness, where it was something that made something as simple as, I remember getting to practice with him a few times, and he would do this thing at the beginning of his practice where he'd just start like with a few fingers, and it was like he was like a child that was discovering his hand for the first time, and there's just so much poetry in that. And so he continues to live in my heart as somebody that really taught me about that kind of innocence and that kind of fun and humor and power. And I've been married 17 years to my wife Chandra, and she is a force of nature herself. And so I see her as one of my most intimate and powerful gurus, and really somebody who has helped me to work with all of the roughness and all of the insensitivity and the basic impatience that I think I brought into our marriage in a way that is at this point just something that I'm very grateful for. I think that as a doctor, I'm solicited for advice regularly, and I think it's something, especially with my children, and especially my daughter now who's 16, I'm having to really recognize the difference between solicited advice and unsolicited advice. So I'm weaning myself off of having opinions about everything, especially with my family. But if I was going to pontificate on something that I think is wise to remember with yoga practice, is that if you're a teacher, if you're somebody that's going to share this, it's very important to keep a part of your practice completely private. Keep something about it that you're the only one that knows about it, or you've gotten taught something from a teacher and you're cultivating it in the privacy of your own practice, and then it doesn't have to take any form, because as soon as you start to teach, it takes on a form. You have to define it by the convention of language and the convention of expressing it to whoever you might want to teach. And you also get a chance to digest it, so that when you get to a point of possibly teaching something, it's like a mama bird feeding a baby bird. You're literally putting the food in the mouth of the student in a sense, and if that food is digestible, it's going to nourish them. And so when you kind of cook that down inside of you, that refinement that happens in your own practice is really important, but it's also essential to being in service as a teacher, seeing your role of being a servant to something bigger than yourself. And in the larger picture of that, when you become a servant to reality with a capital R, it means you're willing to integrate the light and the dark within you. It means you're willing to open yourself to all of what the pain and pleasure, the grace and the horror, the thick and thin of embodied life, as well as opening yourself completely to the freedom and the limitlessness and the clarity and the luminosity of spiritual experience and insight. And that our role as humans is really to create an alchemy where we're forging the jewels of wisdom in the minds of our experience under pressure and heat. Our embodied experience has that quality. of being often very intense, very difficult, but that's where those jewels of wisdom are formed, and that like a diamond that will take the prism of light and show you the full spectrum of light, the colors in light. In that same way, when you forge those diamonds, the light of that wisdom is what allows you to include all that life has to present, all of its shades of dark and light, pain and pleasure, etc.